Two great mysteries dominate our lives, love and money. What is love is a question that has been endlessly explored in stories, songs, books, movies, and television. But the same cannot be said about the question, what is money? It's not surprising that monetary theory hasn't inspired any blockbuster movies, but it was not even mentioned at the schools most of us attended. For most of us, the question, where does money come from, brings to mind a picture of the mint, printing bills and stamping coins. Money, most of us believe, is created by the government. It's true, but only to a point. Those metal and paper symbols of value we usually think of as money are indeed produced by an agency of the federal government called the Mint. But the vast majority of money is not created by the Mint. It is created in huge amounts every day by private corporations known as banks. Most of us believe that banks lend out money that has been entrusted to them by depositors. Easy to picture, but not the truth. In fact, banks create the money they loan, not from the bank's own earnings, not from the money deposited, but directly from the borrower's promise to repay. The borrower's signature on the loan papers is an obligation to pay the bank the amount of the loan plus interest, or lose the house, the car, whatever asset was pledged as collateral. That's a big commitment from the borrower. What does the same signature require of the bank? The bank gets to conjure into existence the amount of the loan and just write it into the borrower's account. Sound far-fetched? Surely that can't be true. But it is. To demonstrate how this miracle of modern banking came about, consider this simple story, the goldsmith's tale. Once upon various times, pretty much anything was used as money. It just had to be portable, and enough people had to have faith that it could later be exchanged for things of real value, like food, clothing, and shelter. Shells, cocoa beans, pretty stones, even feathers have been used as money. Gold and silver were attractive, soft, and easy to work with, so some cultures became expert with these metals. Goldsmiths made trade much easier by casting coins, standardized units of these metals whose weight and purity was certified. Well, to protect his gold, the goldsmith needed a vault, and soon his fellow townsmen were knocking on his door, wanting to rent space to safeguard their own coins and valuables. Before long, the goldsmith was renting every shelf in the vault and earning a small income from his vault rental business. Years went by, and the goldsmith made an astute observation. Depositors rarely came in to remove their actual physical gold, and they never all came in at once. That was because the claim checks the goldsmith had written as receipts for the gold were being traded in the marketplace as if they were the gold itself. This paper money was far more convenient than heavy coins, and amounts could simply be written instead of laboriously counted one by one for each transaction. Meanwhile, the goldsmith had another business. He lent out his gold, charging interest. Well, as convenient claim check money came into acceptance, borrowers began asking for their loans in the form of these claim checks instead of the actual metal. As industry expanded, more and more people asked the goldsmith for loans. This gave the goldsmith an even better idea. He knew that very few of his depositors ever removed their actual gold, so the goldsmith figured he could easily get away with lending out claim checks against his depositors' gold, in addition to his own. As long as the loans were repaid, his depositors would be none the wiser and no worse off, and the goldsmith, now more banker than artisan, would make a far greater profit than he could by lending only his own gold. For years, the goldsmith secretly enjoyed a good income from the interest earned on everybody else's deposits. Now a prominent lender, he grew steadily richer than his fellow townsmen, and he flaunted it. Suspicions grew that he was spending his depositors' money. His depositors got together and threatened withdrawal of their gold if the goldsmith didn't come clean about his newfound wealth. Contrary to what one might expect, this did not turn out to be a disaster for the goldsmith. Despite the duplicity inherent in his scheme, his idea did work. The depositors had not lost anything. Their gold was all safe in the goldsmith's vault. Well, rather than taking back their gold, the depositors demanded that the goldsmith, now their banker, cut them in by paying them a share of the interest. And that was the beginning of banking. The banker paid a low interest rate on deposits of other people's money that he then loaned out at a higher interest. The difference covered the bank's cost of operation and its profit. The logic of this system was simple, and it seemed like a reasonable way to satisfy the demand for credit. However, this is not the way banking works today. Our goldsmith banker was not content with the income remaining after sharing the interest earnings with his depositors, and the demand for credit was growing fast as Europeans spread out across the world. But his loans were limited by the amount of gold his depositors had in his vault. That's when he got an even bolder idea. Since no one but himself knew what was actually in his vaults, he could lend out claim checks on gold that wasn't even there. As long as all the claim check holders didn't come to the vault at the same time and demand real gold, how would anyone find out? This new scheme worked very well, and the banker became enormously wealthy on the interest paid on gold that did not exist. The idea that the banker would just create money out of nothing was too outrageous to believe, so for a long time the thought did not occur to people. But the power to just invent money went to the banker's head, as you can well imagine. In time, the magnitude of the banker's loans and his ostentatious wealth did trigger suspicions once again. Some borrowers started to demand real gold instead of paper representations. Rumors spread. Suddenly, several wealthy depositors showed up to remove their gold. The game was up. A sea of claim check holders flooded the street outside the closed doors of the bank. Alas, the banker did not have enough gold and silver to redeem all the paper he had put into their hands. This is called a run on the bank, and it is what every banker dreads. This phenomenon of a run on the bank ruined individual banks and, not surprisingly, damaged public confidence in all bankers. It would have been straightforward to outlaw the practice of creating money from nothing. But the large volumes of credit the bankers were offering had become essential to the success of European commercial expansion, so instead the practice was legalized and regulated. Bankers agreed to abide by limits on the amount of fictional loan money that could be lent out. The limit would still be a number much larger than the actual value of gold and silver in the vault. Quite often the ratio was 9 fictional dollars to 1 actual dollar in gold. These regulations were enforced by surprise inspections. It was also arranged that, in the event of a run, central banks would support local banks with emergency infusions of gold. Only if there were runs on a lot of banks simultaneously would the banker's credit bubble burst and the system come crashing down. Over the years, the fractional reserve system and its integrated network of banks backed by a central bank has become the dominant money system of the world. At the same time, the fraction of gold backing the debt money has steadily shrunk to nothing. The basic nature of money has changed. In the past, a paper dollar was actually a receipt that could be redeemed for a fixed weight of gold or silver. In the present, a paper or digital dollar can only be redeemed for another paper or digital dollar. In the past, privately created bank credit existed only in the form of private banknotes, which people had the choice to refuse, just as we have the choice to refuse someone's private check today. In the present, privately created bank credit is legally convertible to government-issued fiat currency, the dollars, loonies, and pounds we habitually think of as money. Fiat currency is money created by government fiat or decree, and legal tender laws declare that citizens must accept this fiat money as payment for debt, or else the courts will not enforce the obligation. So now the question is, if governments and banks can both just create money, then how much money exists? In the past, the total amount of money in existence was limited to the actual physical quantities of whatever commodity was in use as money. For example, in order for new gold or silver money to be created, more gold or silver had to be found and dug out of the ground. In the present, money is literally created as debt. New money is created whenever anyone takes a loan from the bank. As a result, the total amount of money that can be created has only one real limit: the total level of debt. Governments place an additional statutory limit on the creation of new money by enforcing rules known as fractional reserve requirements. Essentially arbitrary, fractional reserve requirements vary from country to country and from time to time. In the past, it was common to require banks to have at least $1 worth of real gold in the vault to back $10 worth of debt money created. Today, reserve requirement ratios no longer apply to the ratio of new money to gold on deposit, but merely to the ratio of new debt money to existing debt money on deposit in the bank. Today, a bank's reserves consist of two things: the amount of government-issued cash or equivalent that the bank has deposited with the central bank, plus the amount of already existing debt money the bank has on deposit. To illustrate this in a simple way, let's imagine that a new bank has just started up and has no depositors yet. However, the bank's investors have made a reserve deposit of $1,111.12 of existing cash money at the central bank. The required reserve ratio is 9-to-1. Step 1. The door is open and the new bank welcomes its first loan customer. He needs $10,000 to buy a car. At the 9-to-1 reserve ratio, the new bank's reserve at the central bank, also known as high-powered money, allows it to legally conjure into existence 9 times that amount, or $10,000, on the basis of the borrower's pledge of debt. This $10,000 is not taken from anywhere. It's brand new money simply typed into the borrower's account as bank credit. The borrower then writes a check on that bank credit to buy the used car. Step 2. The seller then deposits this newly created $10,000 at her bank. Unlike the high-powered government money deposited at the central bank, this newly created credit money cannot be multiplied by the reserve ratio. Instead, it's divided by the reserve ratio. At a ratio of 9-to-1, a new loan of $9,000 can be created on the basis of the $10,000 deposit. Step 3. If that $9,000 is then deposited by a third party at the same bank that created it or at a different one, it becomes the legal basis for a third issue of bank credit, this time for the amount of $8,100. Like one of those Russian dolls, where each layer contains a slightly smaller doll inside, each new deposit contains the potential for a slightly smaller loan in an infinitely decreasing series. Now, if the loan money created is not deposited at the bank, the process stops. That's the unpredictable part of the money creation mechanism. But more likely, at every step, the new money will be deposited at a bank, and the reserve ratio process can repeat itself over and over until almost $100,000 of brand new money has been created within the banking system. All of this new money has been created entirely from debt, and the whole process has been legally authorized by the initial reserve deposit of just $1,111.12, which is still sitting untouched at the central bank. What's more, under this ingenious system, the books of each bank in the chain must show that the bank has 10% more on deposit than it has out on loan. This gives banks a very real incentive to seek deposits in order to be able to make loans, supporting the general but misleading impression that loans come out of deposits. Now, unless all the successive loans are deposited at the same bank, It cannot be said that any one bank got to multiply its initial high-powered money reserve almost 90 times by issuing bank credit out of nothing. However, the banking system is a closed loop. Bank credit created at one bank becomes a deposit in another, and vice versa. In a theoretical world of perfectly equal exchanges, the ultimate effect would be exactly the same as if the whole process took place within one bank. That is, the bank's initial central bank reserve of a little over $1,100 allows it to ultimately collect interest on up to $100,000 the bank never had. If that sounds ridiculous, try this. In recent decades, as a result of steady lobbying by the banks, the requirements to make a reserve deposit at the nation's central bank have all but disappeared in some countries, and actual reserve ratios can be much higher than 9-to-1. For some types of accounts, 20-to-1 and 30-to-1 ratios are common. And even more recently, by using loan fees to raise the required reserve from the borrower, banks have now found a way to circumvent reserve requirement limitations entirely. So, while the rules are complex, the common sense reality is actually quite simple. Banks can create as much money as we can borrow. Despite the endlessly presented mint footage, government-created money typically accounts for less than 5% of the money in circulation. More than 95% of all money in existence today was created by someone signing a pledge of indebtedness to a bank. What's more, this bank credit money is being created and destroyed in huge amounts every day, as new loans are made and old ones repaid. Banks can only practice this money system with the active cooperation of government. First, governments pass legal tender laws to make us use the national fiat currency. Secondly, governments allow private bank credit to be paid out in this government currency. Thirdly, government courts enforce debts. And lastly, governments pass regulations to protect the money system's functionality and credibility with the public, while doing nothing to inform the public about where money really comes from. The simple truth is that when we sign on the dotted line for a so-called loan or mortgage, our signed pledge of payment, backed by the assets we pledge to forfeit should we fail to pay, is the only thing of real value involved in the transaction. To anyone who believes we will honor our pledge, that loan agreement or mortgage is now a portable, exchangeable, and saleable piece of paper. It's an IOU. It represents value and is therefore a form of money. This money the borrower exchanges for the bank's so-called loan. Now, a loan in the real world means that the lender must have something to lend. If you need a hammer, my loaning you a promise to provide a hammer I don't have won't be of much help. But in the artificial world of money, a bank's promise to pay money it doesn't have is allowed to be passed off as money, and we accept it as such. Once the borrower signs the pledge of debt, the bank then balances the transaction by creating, with a few keystrokes on a computer, a matching debt of the bank to the borrower. From the borrower's point of view, this becomes loan money in his or her account, and because the government allows this debt of the bank to the borrower to be converted to government fiat currency, everyone has to accept it as money. Again, the basic truth is very simple. Without the document the borrower signed, the banker would have nothing to lend. Have you ever wondered how everyone, governments, corporations, small businesses, families, can all be in debt at the same time and for such astronomical amounts? Have you ever questioned how there can be that much money out there to lend? Now you know. There isn't. Banks do not lend money. They simply create it from debt. And as debt is potentially unlimited, so is the supply of money. And as it turns out, the opposite situation is also true. Isn't it astounding that despite the incredible wealth of resources, innovation, and productivity that surrounds us, almost all of us, from governments to companies to individuals, are heavily in debt to bankers? If only people would stop and think, how can that be? How can it be that the people who actually produce all the real wealth in the world are in debt to those who merely lend out the money that represents the wealth? Even more amazing is that once we realize that money really is debt, we realize that if there was no debt, there'd be no money. If this is news to you, you are not alone. Most people imagine that if all debts were paid off, the state of the economy would improve. It's certainly true on an individual level. Just as we have more money to spend when our loan payments are finished, we think that if everyone were out of debt, there would be more money to spend in general. But the truth is the exact opposite. There would be no money at all. There it is. We are totally dependent on continually renewed bank credit for there to be any money in existence. No loans, no money, which is what happened during the Great Depression. The money supply shrank drastically as the supply of loans dried up. And that's not all. Banks create only the amount of the principal. They don't create the money to pay the interest. Where is that supposed to come from? The only place borrowers can go to obtain the money to pay interest is the general economy's overall money supply. But almost all that overall money supply has been created exactly the same way, as bank credit that has to be paid back with more than was created. So everywhere there are other borrowers in the same situation, frantically trying to obtain the money they need to pay back both principal and interest from a total money pool which contains only principal. It is clearly impossible for everyone to pay back the principal plus interest because the interest money doesn't exist. This can even be expressed by a simple mathematical formula. The big problem here is that for long-term loans, such as mortgages and government debt, the total interest far exceeds the principal. So unless a lot of extra money is created to pay the interest, it means a very high proportion of foreclosures and a non-functioning economy. To maintain a functional society, the rate of foreclosure needs to be low. And so, to accomplish this, more and more new debt money has to be created to satisfy today's demands for money to service the previous debt. But of course, this just makes the total debt bigger, and that means more interest must ultimately be paid, resulting in an ever-escalating and inescapable spiral of mounting indebtedness. It is only the time lag between money's creation as new loans and its repayment that keeps the overall shortage of money from catching up and bankrupting the entire system. However, as the bank's insatiable credit monster gets bigger and bigger, the need to create more and more debt money to feed it becomes increasingly urgent. Why are interest rates so low? Why do we get unsolicited credit cards in the mail? Why is the U.S. government spending faster than ever? Could it be to stave off collapse of the entire monetary system? A rational person has to ask, can this really go on forever? Isn't a collapse inevitable? Money facilitates production and trade. As the money supply increases, money just becomes increasingly worthless unless the volume of production and trade in the real world grows by the same amount. Add to this the realization that when we hear that the economy is growing at 3% per year, it sounds like a constant rate, but it's not. This year's 3% represents more real goods and services than last year's 3% because it's 3% of the new total. Instead of a straight line, as is naturally visualized from the words, it is really an exponential curve getting steeper and steeper. The problem, of course, is that perpetual growth of the real economy requires perpetually escalating use of real-world resources and energy. More and more stuff has to go from natural resource to garbage every year, forever, just to keep this system from collapsing. What can we do about this downright scary situation? For one thing, we need a very different concept of money. It's time more people ask themselves and their governments 4 simple questions. Around the world, governments borrow money at interest from private banks. Government debt is a major component of total debt, and servicing that debt takes a big chunk of our taxes. Now we know that banks simply create the money they lend, and that governments have given them permission to do this. So the first question is, why do governments choose to borrow money from private banks at interest when government could create all the interest-free money it needs itself? And the second big question is, why create money as debt at all? Why not create money that circulates permanently and doesn't have to be perpetually reborrowed at interest in order to exist? The third question, how can a money system that can only function with perpetually accelerating growth be used to build a sustainable economy? Isn't it logical that perpetually accelerating growth and sustainability are incompatible? And finally, what is it about our current system that makes it totally dependent on perpetual growth? What needs to be changed to allow the creation of a sustainable economy? At one time, charging any interest on a loan was called usury and was subject to severe penalties, including death. Every major religion forbade usury. Most of the arguments made against the practice were moral. It was held that money's only legitimate purpose was to facilitate the exchange of real goods and services. Any form of making money from simply having money was regarded as the act of a parasite or of a thief. However, as the credit needs of commerce increased, the moral arguments eventually gave way to the argument that lending involves risk and loss of opportunity to the lender, and therefore attempting to make a profit from lending is justified. Today, these notions seem quaint. Today, the idea of making money from money is held as an ideal to strive for. Why work when you can get your money to work for you? However, in trying to envision a sustainable future, it's very clear that the charging of interest is both a moral and a practical problem. Imagine a society and economy that can endure for centuries because, instead of plundering its capital stores of energy, it restricts itself to present-day income. No more wood is harvested than grows in the same period. All energy is renewable, solar, gravitational, geothermal, magnetic, and whatever else we discover. This society lives within the limits of its non-renewable resources by reusing and recycling everything, and the population just replaces itself. Such a society could never function using a money system utterly dependent on perpetually accelerating growth. A stable economy would need a money supply at least capable of remaining stable without collapsing. Let's say the total volume of this stable money supply is represented by this big circle. Let's also imagine that moneylenders must actually have existing money to lend. If some people within this money supply begin systematically lending money at interest, their share of the money supply will grow. If they continually reloan at interest all the money that gets paid back, what's the inevitable result? Whether it's gold, fiat, or debt money doesn't matter. The moneylenders will end up with all the money. And after the foreclosures and bankruptcies are all filed, they'll get all the real property too. Only if the proceeds of lending at interest were evenly distributed among the population would this central problem be solved. Heavy taxation of bank profits might accomplish this goal, but then why would banks want to be in business? If we were ever able to free ourselves of the current situation, we could imagine banking run as a non-profit service to society, dispersing its interest earnings as a universal citizen dividend, or lending without charging interest at all. If it is the fundamental nature of the system that causes the problems, tinkering with the system cannot ever solve those problems. The system itself must be replaced. Many monetary critics call for a return to gold-based money, claiming that gold has a long history of reliability. They ignore the many scams that can be played with gold, shaving coins, debasing the metal, cornering the market, all of which were abundantly practiced in ancient Rome and contributed to its fall. Some advocate silver at being more abundant than gold and therefore more difficult to corner. Many question the need to bring back precious metals at all. No one wants to go back to carrying heavy sacks of coins to go shopping. It's a certainty that paper, digital, plastic, or more likely biometric ID money would be the real medium of trade, with the same potential for creating unlimited debt money we have now. Beyond that, if gold again became the sole legal basis of money, those who have no gold would suddenly have no money. Other monetary reform advocates have concluded that greed and dishonesty are the main problems, and that there may be better ways to create an honest and equitable money system than returning to silver or gold. Inventive minds have proposed a variety of alternate ways to create money. Many private barter systems create money as debt, much as banks do, but it is done openly and without charging interest. An example is a barter system in which debt is expressed as pledges of hours of work, all work being valued equally at a dollar figure that then allows hours to be equated with the dollar price of goods. This kind of money system can be set up by anyone who can devise a way to do the accounting and find willing and trustworthy participants. Setting up a local barter money system, even if it were little used now, would be prudent emergency planning for any community. Monetary reform, like electoral reform, is a big topic, and one that requires a willingness to change and to think outside the box. Monetary reform, again, like electoral reform, will not come easily, because the enormously powerful interests that benefit from the existing system will do their utmost to maintain their advantage. Now that we've seen that money is just an idea, and that in reality money can be whatever we make it, here's one very simple alternative monetary concept to consider. This model is based on systems that have worked in the past, in England and America, systems that were undermined and destroyed by the goldsmith bankers and their fractional reserve system. create an economy based on permanent interest-free money, money could simply be created and spent into the economy by the government, preferably on long-lasting infrastructure that facilitates the economy, such as roads, railroads, bridges, harbors, and public markets. This money would not be created as debt, it would be created as value, that value being in the form of whatever it was spent on. If this new money facilitated a proportional increase in trade requiring its use, it would cause no inflation whatsoever. If government spending did cause inflation, there would be two courses of action available. Inflation is equivalent in effect to a flat tax on money. Whether the money goes down in value 20% or the government takes 20% of our money away from us, the effect on our buying power is the same. Viewed this way, inflation in place of taxation might be politically acceptable if well spent and kept within limits. Or government could choose to counter inflation by collecting tax monies that it then takes out of use, thus reducing the money supply and restoring its value. To control deflation, which is the phenomenon of falling wages and prices, the government would simply spend more money into existence. With no competing private debt money creation, governments would have more effective control of their nation's money supply. The public would know whom to blame if things went wrong. Governments would rise and fall on their ability to preserve the value of money. Government would operate primarily on taxes, as it does now, but tax money would go much, much further, as none of it would be required to pay interest to private bankers. There could be no national debt if the federal government simply created the money it needed. Our perpetual collective servitude to the banks through interest payments on government debt would be impossible. What we have been taught to believe as democracy and freedom has become in reality an ingenious and invisible form of economic dictatorship. As long as our entire society remains utterly dependent on bank credit for its supply of money, bankers will be in the position to make the decisions on who gets the money they need and who doesn't. Few people are aware today that the history of the United States since the Revolution in 1776 has been, in large part, the story of an epic struggle to get free and stay free of control by the European international banks. This struggle was finally lost in 1913, when President Woodrow Wilson signed into effect the Federal Reserve Act, putting the international banking cartel in charge of creating America's money. The power of this system is deeply ingrained. So is the educational and media silence on the subject. Years ago, a Canadian Deputy Prime Minister surveyed scores of non-economists, both highly educated professionals and common-sense people on the street, and found that not one of them had an accurate understanding of how money is created. In fact, it's probably safe to say that most people, including the frontline employees of banks, have never given the matter a moment's thought. Have you? The modern money as debt system was born a little over 300 years ago, when the first Bank of England was set up with a royal charter for fractional lending of gold receipts at a modest ratio of 2 to 1. That modest ratio was just the proverbial foot in the door. The system is now worldwide, creates virtually unlimited amounts of money out of thin air, and has almost everyone on the planet chained to a perpetually growing debt that can never be paid off. Could it have all happened by accident? Or is it a conspiracy? Obviously, something very big is at stake here.
Drawer goes after the post box.
Maybe your first experience of putting money in the bank wasn't quite as heartwarming as this, but odds are, years later, you still refer to the balance showing on your bank account as being your money in the bank. But it isn't. If we have a deposit box at the bank, the valuables we put in it are still ours. We're just renting secure space to store them. In common usage, the word deposit means to set something down. But the use of the word deposit to refer to a bank account is misleading. A bank deposit is in reality a loan. What the amount in our bank account really indicates is how much money the bank owes us. It's a record of the bank's promise to pay us money, not the money we deposited itself. The difference is important. The truth is, when we hand the contents of our piggy bank to the bank teller, our money becomes the bank's money to do with as it pleases. All of the money in the bank is the bank's money. None of it is ours. That's why the bank pays us interest. We have loaned the bank our money. This may seem to be a semantic distinction. We know we can go to the bank at any time and take our money out in cash if we want to. But the distinction is not semantic, nor is it trivial. The distinction is crucial. What happens in banking affects everyone, and yet few of us know anything at all about how banking really works. The entire world economy now runs on a system of credit provided by banks, and when that credit system breaks down, everyone suffers. To make things worse, the explanations for these breakdowns offered by the experts never look at the root cause, namely, that other than cash and coins, which make up just 1 to 5% of money in circulation, all the money in existence today was created as the principal of a bank loan, with the banks requiring principal plus interest as so-called repayment. Not only does this make the existence of money entirely dependent on the existence of bank credit, it makes the system as a whole bankrupt by design, as total debits, principal plus interest, exceed total assets from the moment the first loan document is signed. As the global banking system staggers towards worldwide collapse, more and more people are realizing they can no longer ignore the realities behind banking as it is practiced today. Many have lost their homes and jobs due entirely to the unsustainable practices of moneylenders. It's time people understood money and the pressing need to fundamentally change the way it works. Clarifying what the words used in banking really mean is the first step. Now that we know that a deposit is, in truth, a loan to a bank, the next question is, what is a loan that we take out from a bank? When we sign for a loan, we give the bank a pledge to pay the amount of the loan plus interest. In return, the bank credits our account in the same amount as this so-called loan. While we speak of the bank as having put the loan money into our account, in reality, the only thing the bank puts into our account is its promise to pay the money. What has actually happened is an exchange of promises. Neither party has delivered anything to the other except matching pledges of debt. So who is the borrower and who is the lender? The terms loan, lender, and borrower are all misleading. The truth is that the two parties have traded promises to pay and in the process created something called bank credit or checkbook money that can be legally spent as money. Bank credit can be spent because we, in our innocence, notice that each time we deposit into our account, it increases our balance by the same amount. In fact, unless we put something in, our account will be empty. Thus, it's a natural assumption that money in an account is money someone put in. The account is a promise to pay, not the money itself. In fact, a promise always indicates the absence of the item promised. Otherwise, why does it need to be promised? Now, because all bank accounts are just promises to pay, the bank and the borrower can simply exchange promises and, in the flash of a few keystrokes, a positive balance appears in the borrower's bank account without anyone putting existing money in. Now you know the real source of what we call a bank loan. How different would it be if two parties just got together in a basement with a printing press and created new money that way? We intuitively understand the act of fraud called counterfeiting. In printing fake $100 bills, the counterfeiters also create new money out of thin air. Money gives us the ability to purchase the real goods and services of the world. It's clear that the counterfeiters have created new ability to purchase real goods and services without giving anything in exchange except a fancy piece of paper. Counterfeiters get something for nothing directly at the expense of whoever gets caught with their counterfeit money. And if the counterfeit money is not discovered, it dilutes the money supply, stealing from everyone. Counterfeiting is a serious crime, and it is easy to understand why. It's cheating on a basic social agreement, thou shalt not steal. But taking a loan from a bank also creates new purchasing power. However, instead of being considered a form of theft, it is the very basis of our monetary system. How did one form of creating money out of thin air become a crime and the other become standard business practice and the source of almost all our money? For this is what has happened. To understand how, we need to look at the history of the laws governing commerce. But before that, we need to understand the logic of the loan process itself. The borrower wants to purchase an item, but doesn't have the funds to do so at the present time. However, the borrower does have confidence in having sufficient funds over time to pay both the original price of the item and the interest on a loan. So he goes to a bank to arrange a loan. The borrower is capable of making a credible promise of money in the future, but otherwise at this moment he comes with empty pockets. That's why he needs the loan. We're probably all familiar with what happens next. The bank gets the borrower to sign an agreement in which the borrower promises to pay the bank the amount of the loan plus interest, or, in default, surrender to the bank the object that is to be purchased with the loan. This is done countless times every day all over the world. But there's a problem. How can the borrower pledge as collateral something that the borrower does not yet own? If I wanted to borrow $10,000 from you to go on a luxury cruise to Europe, would you accept my neighbor's car as collateral? Of course not, because you know very well that I have no legal right to give you my neighbor's car, no matter how much I owe you. But if instead I promise to buy my neighbor's car with the $10,000 you lend me, the situation is different. You might agree to lend me the $10,000, believing I will buy the car, and will pledge it as collateral for the loan once I obtain legal title to it. However, until the transaction is completed, your $10,000 loan cannot be secured by title to the car. This sequence of events problem could be very simply avoided. You could buy the car and then sell it to me. The bank could do it this way too. If the borrower commits to the bank to buy the item, why doesn't the bank just buy it with its own money and then sell it to the borrower on time payments at interest? Well, the answer to that question is also very simple. It's because the bank, like the borrower, has come to the transaction with empty pockets. The bank fulfills its part of the so-called loan transaction by creating an account for the borrower. The truth is, the so-called borrower has funded his own account by fraudulently pledging a car he does not yet own as collateral. And the bank, the so-called lender, hasn't put up any existing money at all. And, if all goes well, it never will. The borrower believes the new numbers in his account now represent his money in the bank. He, like the rest of us, doesn't understand the difference between existing money and a promise of money. If you can spend it, what does it matter? So now the question is, will the seller of the item accept the bank's promise to pay? While some people may hold out for cash, most will say yes to a check or an electronic funds transfer from the buyer's bank. Why? Because the seller knows from experience that she can deposit the check at her bank and it will increase her account accordingly. So what happens next? Well, obviously the buyer's bank now owes the seller's bank the amount of the loan. So you might be thinking, isn't this where the money comes out of deposits? The bank's promise to pay the borrower has just been transformed by the transaction into a promise to pay the seller's bank instead. So now the buyer's bank has to transfer some of its existing money to the seller's bank, correct? Yes, but probably only a small proportion. And over the long term, as long as the bank gets its fair share of deposits, the net amount of existing money the bank needs to cover its loans can theoretically be zero. How? Well, imagine first that the seller has her account at the same bank as the buyer. She deposits the buyer's check into her account. All the bank has to do to complete the transaction is reduce the buyer's account by the same amount it increases the seller's account. As both accounts are just promises, no existing money is involved in doing this. What is the end result? The bank has created bank credit for the borrower to the sum of $10,000. The borrower has bought the car that existed in the world of real things, and the seller now has that bank credit of $10,000. Thus, a brand new claim upon $10,000 worth of real goods of value was accomplished with absolutely $0 of the bank's or anybody else's money. On top of that, the bank gets to have all this so-called money paid back by the borrower's honest toil, plus interest, or the bank gets the car. Magic like this is usually seen on stage. So now let's examine what happens if the seller deposits her check in a different bank. Won't that require a transfer of existing bank funds from the buyer's bank to the seller's bank? Perhaps, but it will almost certainly never be anywhere near the whole amount because, in effect, the banking system functions as one bank. To illustrate, let's add another transaction to this scenario. That same day, the seller's bank made a similar loan to a little old lady who bought a mega home theater system. The electronics store deposited her check at their bank. The electronics store's bank made a similar loan that was deposited at the original borrower's bank. And when all the various balances were settled, the banks didn't owe each other anything. And even if there were differences, they would have been just a small portion of the total credit created. So, at this point we can say that although banks don't actually lend out their depositors' money, as most of us imagine, they still need deposits to make loans. This is because banks need incoming credit from other banks to offset their own credit being deposited at those banks. As long as banks keep their outgoing credit balanced with incoming credit, they are free to make new loans and thereby keep creating brand new credit money. None of it will ever have to come out of the bank's pockets. The bank is free to invest its own funds in corporate and government bonds and whatever other instruments their charter allows. If one draws a diagram of it all, it looks like this. The interest governments and corporations pay the banks on their bonds is paid by us. We pay it as a portion of our taxes, and we pay it in the price of all the goods and services that we buy. And there is another thing passed on to us as well, and that's the risk that the bank will go broke and not be able to honor its promises to pay. Now you may wonder, how can a bank go broke if it doesn't put any money up in the first place? What have they got to lose? The answer to that question is that banks differ from counterfeiters in that the banks are legally allowed to create new money, but only by certain rules of accounting. Banks can only create money by entering a borrower's payments and collateral as an asset on the positive side of the ledger, balanced on the negative side by the loan, or what the banks call the deposit liability created by the bank. When the borrower defaults on the payments, the asset pledged as collateral is seized by the bank and sold. In a declining market, when repossession is most common, the new lower value of the asset doesn't cover the bank's liabilities, which were based on the previous higher value. This shows up as a loss on the bank's books. When foreclosures are rampant, as in a collapsing real estate market, much of the value of the bank's collateral simply evaporates as home prices drop, exposing the bank to huge losses. In truth, it's all just numbers, created out of thin air. But banks must adhere to the dictates of these numbers, and the consequences of bank arithmetic gone wrong can include economic standstill, social disintegration, total financial chaos, lawlessness, starvation, and war. However, for the purposes of understanding the anatomy of a loan, we shall assume that the system is still functional, and all three of the loans we were looking at will get paid. The end result is that not $1 of existing money has changed hands, but $30,000 of new bank credit has been created and spent into the money supply, and each of the three banks gets to collect interest on $10,000 of it. Is creation of this brand new $30,000 really an act of fraud, like counterfeiting? The obvious difference is that the banking system is legal, regulated by government, and disciplined by the courts to follow the rules of accounting. Another difference is that there is no obvious victim, like the person getting caught with a counterfeit bill. Banks argue that the buyer and the seller both got what they wanted and agreed to, so where is the fraud? And if there was a fraud, who lost out? Well, to determine that, let us list who got what out of the deal. The borrower got the item he desired on terms he willingly agreed to. He may curse his decision later as he struggles to make the interest payments, or he may live happily ever after, thankful he got the loan. The seller got an increase in bank credit, which she's been conditioned since childhood to think of as her money in the bank. She's confident that she'll be able to spend it in turn, and she will. So, as far as the seller is concerned, she has been paid in full. She's happy. So who, if anyone, suffered as a result of the deal? Is there another party to this transaction we've overlooked? Well, there's also the bank that gets to collect interest on a promise to pay money. That's the business they're in and usually do very well by. And anyone else? Well, where did the car come from? It came from the world of real things. Natural resources, energy, and labor were expended to produce it. What if we consider the hidden party to be society at large and the natural world from which all things ultimately come? Because the brand new bank credit money didn't just sit there, it got spent into the general circulation in the real world. It's the real world that ultimately gets the new money in exchange for its car. This new money might stimulate new production, temporarily enlarging the economy, making lots of people happy. In fact, it often does, as most bank credit comes into being as a home mortgage, stimulus for the residential construction industry, a big provider of good-paying jobs. However, after its initial productive use, this newly created money will basically just dilute the money supply, reducing money's purchasing power by a very small amount. So, in contrast to counterfeiting, where the loss occurs to a specific victim, here the loss is borne by us all, because the real substance of the loan, the car, was extracted from the economy at large by a slight loss in the value of everyone's money. To continue our comparison of bank credit with counterfeiting, counterfeit cash eventually gets detected and removed from circulation, causing a direct loss to whoever accepted it. There is, of course, no guarantee of how much will be detected, nor any prescribed schedule for its removal. Bank credit is also removed from circulation over time because, as bank credit is paid back, the principal part of every payment is extinguished. Now remember that almost all the money in existence today is bank credit. Therefore, almost every dollar that passes through our bank accounts has a scheduled appointment to one day be paid as a principal payment on a bank loan and cease to exist. On top of the principal are the interest payments, which will become bank income, much of which will be recycled into the economy as interest to depositors and other bank expenses. So it's not immediately apparent that there's a loss to someone as a result of bank credit being withdrawn from circulation the way there is with counterfeit cash. But if we look closer, we find an interesting situation. We don't need anything more than fundamental arithmetic to understand the power that lies in controlling the money supply and why, as currently designed, total debt must constantly expand or the system collapses. Whenever the rate of debt money creation falls behind the rate of debt money destruction, the total amount of money in use will shrink. This is called deflation because the money supply is shrinking, like a deflating balloon. The result is less money relative to the goods and services available. With less money around to pay for them, the price of goods and services go down. At first, this sounds like a good thing, and it could be, if money were not created as debt at interest. For anyone not in debt, deflation would be like a general dividend on money, paid in goods and services of our choice. It would be as if money were the people's stock in their own prosperous company, their nation. People wouldn't have to demand a pay raise. If a nation were more productive as a whole, thus deserving of a raise, everyone would benefit automatically by having their money buy more. However, this is definitely not the effect deflation has in a system where money comes in the form of interest-bearing debt. More than 95% of all money currently in existence is in the form of debt to banks, promises to pay with interest added. And as we have seen, the principal is created, but not the interest. Due to the time delay between money's creation and its repayment, and the recycling of interest earnings as bank operating expenses, most of us can keep up our payments while the money supply is increasing. However, if the money supply or total debt is decreasing, money becomes harder to earn due to its scarcity, and fixed payments become harder to meet. For those heavily in debt, the money shortage can become catastrophic. Unfortunately, the psychological effects of falling wages and prices rapidly accelerate the process, as borrowers, including large businesses, lose confidence in being able to repay loans, so that they don't sign up for any. And without new loans to replace old loans, the money shortage rapidly gets worse, resulting in a decrease in jobs and purchasing power, even in the midst of abundant resources and productive capacity. This dismal spiraling math makes mass foreclosures inevitable. Prices plummet as no one wants to spend their money. Shrinking values destroy the value of loan collateral, causing banks to write off huge losses. Some even close their doors. Consumer and business confidence is lost. Rampant economic and social dysfunction follows. This disastrous spiral cannot be turned around unless the government creates new money itself or goes deeply in debt to private banks in order to create enough new money to reorganize and rejuvenate the economy. The most familiar example of this is the stock market crash of 1929. The psychological fallout of the stock market collapse resulted in less borrowing and thus less new money. The Federal Reserve did nothing to correct the resultant deflation, and by 1932 the money supply had been reduced by a third. Countless people were evicted from their homes because the money to make their mortgage payments simply ceased to exist. Then, in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt became the U.S. president. Roosevelt's New Deal set out to restore the economy by restoring the money supply. To counter the money shortage, Roosevelt borrowed from the private banking system. Factories started hiring again. But only when the war arrived, there's suddenly no shortage of jobs or funds available to do what was necessary for the war effort. It was the money expended on World War II that ended the Great Depression. The war also resulted in 50 million deaths worldwide and led to a new hostile international balance of power with its attendant arms races, mounting debts, and sweeping social and technological transformations. The cycle of economic boom and bust is commonly called the business cycle, as if it were a natural occurrence like the hydrological or carbon cycle. These natural cycles are ultimately driven by the sun. But what is it that drives the business cycle? One answer is the supply of money. And as we have seen, the supply of money is dependent on loans. So let's look at what happens during the lifetime of an individual loan. We've seen how bank credit is nothing more than the bank's promise to pay, which the bank has created on its books to balance the borrower's promise to pay that it has received. The bank's promise to pay is usually spent on some real good or service and allowed to circulate, making the efficient exchange of goods and services easier to accomplish. As a medium of exchange, today's promise to pay money is unsurpassed in its usefulness and flexibility. However, because no money is created to pay the interest, a seemingly impossible situation is created. On the face of it, if borrowers had to pay the interest they owe all at once, they would have to fight it out for a limited sum of existing money that was very much less than the total owed. The percentage that would be unable to pay off their loans would be simple to calculate. However, interest is usually paid over time, not all at once. If this interest income is recycled into the general economy as spending, it can be available to be earned repeatedly. Once we understand this, the question of whether interest is actually unpayable becomes more perplexing. Is there such a thing as a sustainable system of lending that does not produce mathematically inevitable defaults? In the Middle Ages, usury, meaning charging interest or any form of making gain solely from having money, was condemned as a sin. While the justification was moral, the reason was practical. In a fixed money supply like gold, anyone systematically rolling over all of their loan money at interest will soon end up with all the money. This problem was a big factor in the ruin of Rome. Private accumulations of gold forced the government to mint coins made of base metals instead of the real thing. Debased currency led to failing confidence and ultimate decline. The lesson was well learned. For the next 1,000 years, the Roman Catholic Church declared collecting interest on a loan to be a sin punishable by excommunication. In some countries, the penalty for practicing usury was death. Is charging interest really a sin? While today it seems very reasonable to charge for the use of money, there's a simple and unavoidable problem with doing so. Unless moneylenders spend every penny of interest they receive in such a way that the borrowers can earn it again, the borrowers are going to come up short regardless of their hard work and personal virtues. Someone will default simply as a result of the arithmetic. This is easy to picture where there's a fixed money supply like gold coin. As long as all of the coins taken in as interest are spent so that the borrowers can earn them, the same coins can be used to pay the interest over and over. The lender can profit by buying real things with this coin, but the coin itself must be spent, not lent nor removed from circulation. Leaving aside any moral considerations, this arrangement would be sustainable. However, if the interest coins are re-lent at interest or removed from circulation by hoarding, there will be an inherent shortage of coins with which to pay off the aggregate debt. The situation is essentially no different in our current debt-based system. As we have seen, nowadays virtually every dollar comes into existence as debt, with a scheduled appointment to be extinguished as a principal payment on the loan that created it. Thus, for all borrowers to be able to make their payments of principal plus interest, two things must be true. The dollar created as the principal of the loan must be available to be earned by the borrower in order to make the principal payment that extinguishes that dollar. And every dollar the borrower pays to the bank as interest must also be available to be repeatedly earned by the borrower so that it can be paid as interest again and again. There is a common theory, undoubtedly popular with lenders, that because the banks spend their interest earnings as operating expenses, interest to depositors, and shareholders' dividends, there is in fact enough money released back into the community to make all payments. However, like the idea of absolute shortage, this is an oversimplification. Picture what happens if someone else, such as you or I or an institutional non-bank lender, obtains this dollar and then lends it out at interest. Well, now that same dollar is simultaneously owed to two lenders and has two simultaneous interest charges attached to it. In addition, if this dollar is loaned, repaid, and reloaned by the secondary lender, it is not available to pay off the principal of the loan that created it, except as another loan. So, can we borrow from Peter to pay Paul and borrow from Paul to pay Peter? This gets interesting. We can. However, each time money is borrowed, there's an interest charge added that also must be paid. If all added interest charges can be earned, all payments can be made. On this basis, many economists and defenders of the current system claim there can never be a shortage of money and all payments can be made. But this seems to be a false assurance. For instance, if secondary lenders capture some of the money needed to retire the loan that created that money, the original loan can never be retired. The deficiency will have to be borrowed over and over forever, each time at interest. Each deficiency will be cumulative, adding to an ever-building total of debt that can never be paid off. And it stands to reason that for each added interest charge in the system as a whole, something extra is demanded of the system as a whole to pay for it. This affects everyone, producers, governments, and consumers. For producers, that something extra must be raised through higher prices or more sales. However, competition for more sales usually requires lowering prices, necessitating even more sales, and leads to overproduction and saturation of the market. The end result can mean job losses, plant closures, and bankruptcies. For governments, that something extra is raised by increasing taxes. But increasing taxes drains money from the productive economy, resulting in a reduction in the collective ability to pay taxes, which then necessitates increased government borrowing and additional interest charges. For consumers, something extra can mean getting an additional job, or borrowing to pay past debts, or paying off debt over longer periods of time. However, competition for jobs tends to lower wages, and paying over longer periods of time adds enormously to the amount of interest owed. And of course, borrowing to pay off past debts is like trying to fill a hole with more hole. And that is the situation we find ourselves in today. Producers can't sell more because consumers can't afford to buy. Governments are cutting taxes, not raising them, hoping to stimulate consumer demand, and consumers' real incomes are limited or even falling due to competition for a limited number of jobs. Therefore, any increase in the total amount of interest charges within the monetary system as a whole will result in a genuine shortage of money. This is because the real productive economy is limited by the availability of nature's resources. The productive economy exists to serve actual needs. It simply cannot keep pace with the demands of the artificial financial economy, which has an unlimited appetite for profit, and which operates with no regard for the natural limitations of the real world. The theory that there's always enough money to pay the interest has a certain elegant simplicity. However, by the very nature of the assertion to be true, it has to be 100% true. This is impossible. For one thing, secondary lenders, who are not banks, do comprise a significant proportion of lenders, and they add their interest charges to money that already bears an interest burden. Beyond that, we have a cultural expectation. Everyone who has money expects it to generate more. Money that needs to be spent and made available to be earned by its original borrower is, instead, lent at interest or invested for gain. Therefore, we can conclude that the two conditions that must be true for all borrowers to be able to make their payments of principal plus interest and thus permanently discharge their debt, those conditions are not met by the current system. Nowhere in the current system is there any restriction on relending money that was created as a loan, nor is there any obligation upon banks to make their profits from interest available to be earned by borrowers, enabling them to extinguish their debts. Quite the opposite. Banks invest these profits to make further profits. And it's not just the banks that cause the problem. Anyone who takes their ball of money and starts rolling it like a snowball to make it bigger does so at the expense of borrowers who will not find that money available to pay their debts, except as more debt. And of course, those rolling the biggest snowballs pick up the most snow. As the saying goes, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Money needed by borrowers in the lower realms of workaday productive economics moves upstairs to play in the casino world of abstract financial profit, and that's a world where transactions are little more than gambling on numbers in an effort to achieve higher numbers. They have little or nothing to do with providing the necessities of life. Today, the largest volume of money by far is changing hands in what is best described as the gambling economy. The foreign exchange markets, the derivatives market, and the rest of the financial instruments being played by banks and investment funds for as much profit as possible. For example, the volume of trade on the world's foreign exchange markets in just 1 week exceeds the total volume of world trade in real goods and services during an entire year. This money is in continuous play by speculators looking to make windfall profits on currency fluctuations. It exists, but only in the gambling economy. So how unpayable is the ubiquitous interest burden in actual fact? That could only be determined with certainty by tracking all the money in the world. With over 6 billion people earning, spending, borrowing, and lending, the world's money flows are at least as complex as the flows of the ocean. They are impossible to know. But the direction is pretty clear and simple, and it's the same old story. The rich are taking increasingly more money into the gambling economy, where ordinary borrowers have almost no chance to obtain it. And the only way the system can stay solvent is to create more money. And as money is created as debt, the only way to create more money is to create more debt in every way possible, including ridiculously easy credit for unqualified borrowers, massive government expenditures on security and war, and bailouts of insolvent banks. How does the individual loan cycle relate to the boom and bust phenomenon known as the business cycle? The individual loan cycle can be described like this. First, there is economic stimulation because of initial spending. This is followed by inflation because new money basically just dilutes the money supply. And eventually, inflation is followed by deflation as loan repayments gradually extinguish the principal, removing that money from circulation. As long as the individual loan cycles don't match up, these cycles can smooth each other out. This creates a fairly stable money supply that leads to fairly stable prices, although continuous growth of the money supply is required, at least in part because, as you will recall, the money to cover the interest was never created. This is the model on which our economy is currently based. Avoiding deflationary spirals and keeping inflation at a level that doesn't upset people's apple carts constitutes the art of managing the economy, which is rather narrowly defined as achieving so-called price stability. However, a look at the purchasing power of the US dollar in real goods over the last century instantly reveals what this so-called price stability has really meant. The dollar has clearly lost almost all of its value, 96%, and is continuing to do so at a rapid pace. So price stability is not being achieved, and one hardly needs a degree in psychology to understand how human nature itself would turn the individual loan cycle into the collective phenomenon of the business cycle. The simple reason being that if one person sees great prospects and is doing well borrowing and expanding, others would have the confidence to do the same. Beyond the merely psychological effects, if one business is expanding on the basis of credit, its suppliers and distributors will find it necessary to do so as well, or lose that business to someone who will. The same herd effect would occur for a gloomy outlook and accompanying credit contraction. Thus, it is entirely predictable that individual loan cycles would have a built-in propensity to line themselves up rather than be randomly distributed. And when they do, we see the larger scale cycle called the business cycle emerging directly from the cumulative effects of individual loan cycles. So, to sum up, one could say that out of the exchange of promises made by the bank and the borrower, society gets chronic inflation and a dependency on banks for increasing infusions of money to pay ultimately impossible interest payments. This results in an inescapable treadmill of accelerating debt and depreciating money, the only alternative being a deflationary collapse of the economy followed by social chaos or war. This eminently unhealthy situation filters down through society, wreaking harm on every level. We are like addicts, but the fix is not more and more heroin, it's more and more credit money. And eventually, our collective ability to borrow and repay so much credit becomes exhausted. This then creates the need for constant expansion of credit into new markets, in essence creating a fiscal imperative to drive everyone in the world further and further into debt forever. In the United States, this constant debt expansion has led to a total credit market debt in 2008 of more than $53 trillion, which is about 5 times the total annual income of the entire country. So is the world at large happy about its end of the loan transaction? Probably not. But the world at large has very little awareness of where these problems originate, the elusive system of counterfeiting and hidden control that is modern banking. And how about the banks? How have the banks fared as a result of this system? Well, first, by putting up only a small fraction of the money they ostensibly lend, the banks have obtained a river of income from interest payments on consumer loans and mortgages. Second, by using their credit powers to acquire large portfolios of corporate and government bonds, banks collectively appropriate control over government and industry. And thirdly, due to the inevitable defaults and foreclosures, the banks gain legal title to a lot of real property the world over. And finally, if the worst happens, if borrowers default en masse, causing the banks large losses, the government is forced to rescue the banks with multi-billion-dollar bailouts to save the financial system. And what are these bailouts financed with? You guessed it, more taxpayer debt. It is really quite an achievement to pull this off, and without most of the victims even being aware of it. If you're now thinking there ought to be a law, well, there is. There's a whole body of law that makes all of this legal. So how did a system like this ever become the law? To answer that, we go back to England in the mid-17th century. With the development of better ships and the new explorations they allowed, trade was expanding rapidly. In order to carry out commerce, especially over great distances and lengths of time, written contracts were becoming more and more important and more sophisticated. Under English common law, it had long been established that a contract could only be enforced if something of real substance had changed hands. A transfer of goods or rights in property was the real stuff of the exchange, and that was what the court would evaluate for fairness, not just the words on the document. A contract under which there had been no exchange of consideration, meaning real goods or rights in property, was deemed to be empty, and was therefore not enforceable by the court. So, a contract in which a borrower, say, pledged a car he does not own in exchange for a bank's promise of payment would not even qualify as a contract. No common law court would enforce it. As well, in the event of a dispute over a contract, under common law, only someone who had actually provided consideration to the transaction, and only someone who delivered the goods, had the right to sue in court for fulfillment of the contract by the other party. This right was not transferable to a third party. When early traders went off personally on expeditions with trade goods, they bought those goods at home with their local currency and would sell them for foreign currency in the distant destination. They would then buy foreign goods with the foreign money, bring those goods home, and sell them for their local currency. Pretty simple. But as trade became more sophisticated, traders became more inclined to stay home and just hire ships to carry out deliveries. This gave traders the freedom to import cargoes of foreign goods from different sources than the destination to which their home goods had been exported. Thus, a problem was created. The exported goods had been paid for with foreign coin, the value of which needed to be spent somewhere else. Moving money as coins entailed a high risk of theft, as well as the near certainty of partial loss by currency conversion in a different land. This problem of payments from a distance was overcome by the use of bills of exchange. A bill of exchange was a signed order from the payer to an addressee demanding that the addressee pay a certain specified sum of money to the person identified as the payee. These were secured by signature, and they could not be acted upon in court by anyone other than the original parties. Thus they were of no use to a thief or any other third party. You probably recognize that these were the precursors of checks. I, the payer, instruct the bank, the addressee, to pay the payee, a person named on the check, a certain sum of money. This was all well and good for transactions among parties who were known to each other. The bill of exchange was used merely as a way to order payment in coin at a distant location. But merchants soon wanted more flexibility. They wanted to be able to use bills of exchange to reconcile payments amongst many merchants in many locations, using bills of exchange like money itself. For this to work, bills of exchange had to be assignable to and enforceable by third parties. As we shall see, this was the moment in legal history that gave sanction to the banking system we have today. A third party, who might have honestly purchased a bill of exchange several steps removed from the original exchange, could not be expected, nor would he have the right, to show up in a common law court and defend the validity of the contract and collect on it. This made third-party bills of exchange an unacceptable risk. So, in order to be able to use bills of exchange as a convenient and guaranteed third-party payment system, essentially equivalent to money, the common law practice had to be set aside regarding bills of exchange. In England, by a series of legal decisions from 1664 to 1699, this problem for commerce was remedied by making bills of exchange enforceable by third parties. If a third party had purchased a bill for valuable consideration and in good faith, having no apparent reason to suspect fraud or some deficiency in the right of the seller to sell it, then the bill automatically became good and enforceable by the court against the signer. What did this change mean? It meant, essentially, that any bill of exchange would be considered legitimate once it was sold. Bills of exchange and all other subsequent types of signed promises to pay, with the notable exception of checks, became transferable and enforceable in court, just what the merchants wanted. Now debt contracts could be sold like things, and transacting business would be a whole lot easier. Not only that, it opened up a whole new market for profit seekers, trading in bills of exchange themselves. The marketing of debt was born. The change in the law had another effect as well. It made it possible to trick or even force a person into signing a legally binding promise to pay, and then, if that promise were purchased by a third party for real consideration and in good faith, it would be enforceable against the signer in court. Ultimately, this became one of the foundational principles of the Uniform Commercial Code, which governs the conduct of business in the United States, and by extension, in most of the world. Think about it. If we buy a stolen laptop from a guy on the street, we're guilty of receiving stolen goods, a criminal offense. Doesn't matter if we paid honest money and were unaware the goods were stolen. The court will restore the goods to the rightful owner. We, as purchasers, innocent or not, lose our money and may even be charged with a crime. But if we buy a loan contract from a banker and give him real value for it in good faith, it doesn't matter that the loan contract may have come into existence under false pretenses. Whoever signed it is required by commercial contract law to pay up, and the courts will enforce the obligation. Today, debt contracts come in a myriad of forms, including and especially loans and mortgages. It's significant to note that just as these common law restrictions were being removed, the brand new Bank of England was being established. The first bank state-authorized to create money out of thin air. The new laws fit in perfectly, making the new bank's empty contracts enforceable against the so-called borrower. Those who have discovered the true nature of their own bank loans and have attempted to challenge the validity of their debt contracts in modern courts have discovered to their dismay that this commercial contract law is still the bedrock defense of money as debt. The bank will have sold the original loan agreement to a third party for value, and even though that third party is often just a sister company of the bank, all that matters to the judge is who possesses the document, what it says, and whose signature is on it. The bank's failure to inform the borrower about the true nature of the loan contract and the absence of any actual money loaned on the bank's part is not relevant. So, to conclude our investigation, it appears that modern banking practice rests on several distinct violations of common law, common sense, and natural justice. The first violation is the fraud the borrower commits by pledging as collateral property the borrower does not yet own. And the bank is complicit, as it knowingly accepts the fraudulent pledge as backing for the credit it creates. The second violation is the failure of the bank to disclose the true nature of the contract. The bank calls it a loan, leading the borrower to believe that he or she is receiving a loan of existing money. But the bank knows full well it has provided only a brand new promise to pay, simply typed in on a computer screen. A promise that the bank knows it will probably never have to fulfill. Thirdly, the loan agreement should be invalid because impossible contracts are legally invalid. The bank is creating an impossible contract because the conditions required to guarantee that the borrowers have the opportunity to pay off the principal plus interest are not met. Unless the system enforces 100% recycling of both principal and interest, which it emphatically does not, some borrowers are going to default and lose their collateral simply due to the systemic shortage of money. The fourth violation is the violation of natural law by the law of contracts, which confers automatic legitimacy of title on any contract if the contract is sold to a third party for valuable consideration. This violates the principle that one cannot give better title to something than one has. But perhaps the biggest fraud of all is that most of the people who produce the real wealth of the world are in debt and at risk of losing everything they have worked for to bankers who fabricate money out of mere promises to pay. And where does this leave us? We are hostages in an economy that must grow faster and faster to keep up with an ever-growing money supply, where the entire system collapses in ruin. The money system as currently structured refuses to recognize that the real economy is limited by the capacity of the planet to provide the raw materials and waste disposal services the economy needs. The planet is finite, and therefore it should be obvious that the economy cannot grow at an accelerating pace forever. Our current money system runs like the bus in the movie Speed. It could not slow down, or the bomb planted on the bus would go off. And our situation is even worse, because the rate of debt creation must forever accelerate, or the entire economy crashes. The notion that infinite, perpetually accelerating growth is possible is the great fallacy of modern economics. It is a fatal delusion born of greed. An economic, social, and environmental crash of unprecedented proportion is surely inevitable, and this monetary system is utterly and hopelessly incapable of adapting to it. No wonder monetary reformers around the world insist that the entire monetary system needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. So what is the solution? One idea many people suggest is to return to the days when money was backed by gold. Gold, they argue, is the true money because it's inherently valuable. The underlying principle here is that money should be a commodity that is valuable due to its scarcity, as gold is scarce. As a general rule, those who hold this view of money also believe that money should exist independent of government. Another school of thought, diametrically opposite, is that the creation of money should be the exclusive prerogative of governments. Government, which represents all the people, should spend money into existence in the public interest, thus backing the currency with what it was spent on. Having taken back the power to simply spend money into existence, government would never need to go into debt or pay interest. Of course, government spending without limit would result in a worthless currency. To prevent inflation, money would also have to be extinguished. This could be accomplished using a wide variety of taxes, resource royalties, and user fees. Government spending and government taxes would, therefore, be interdependent and would equal each other in a perfect equilibrium. However, the goal of taxation would be to achieve price stability, as the government would have no need of tax revenues in order to operate. Over the centuries, both the gold-based system and various government credit money systems have been used, with the gold-based system prevailing well into the 20th century. This wasn't because government credit money didn't work. It did within the country itself, where it was accepted in payment of taxes. But until the invention of modern currency exchanges, international trade had to be carried out in gold. In addition, gold has had an almost supernatural fascination for humans for a very long time. We've been conditioned for millennia to think of money in terms of portable inherent wealth, as in gold coins. However, this is not the only way to think of money. nor in the era of runaway debt money is it any longer accurate. Money is, at its root, an idea that humans invented in order to turn simple subsistence into complex civilization. It's the development of money that made possible specialization of labor and the indirect exchange of goods and services. Throughout money's evolution, from direct barter to standard trade goods, and on to standard coins, to paper promises of precious metal, to digital promises of paper cash, and now to digital promises to pay digital promises. Throughout this long evolution, the prevailing idea has always been to achieve greater flexibility by using convenient and secure promises to pay instead of money itself. The problem with promise to pay money has always been that it provides a golden opportunity to cheat, to create more promises than there is real stuff to back those promises up. But is there a way to make the exchange of actual money just as convenient and secure as the promise to pay system? Now there is. Digital money, convenient and secure, is now a possibility because of new encryption technologies. It works like this. Imagine taking the serial number off a dollar bill and dispensing with the paper. What do you have? A digital dollar. A digital dollar that can now be electronically transferred around the world just as easily and securely as a promise to pay dollar. However, and this is the big however, the digital money, while being entirely electronic, is also like a metal coin. It can never be in two places at once. Thus, the multiplication of promises can be prevented by insisting on actual payment in cash, paper or digital. We don't even need to keep this digital cash in a bank, as it provides its own safekeeping and can be transferred by internet. And instantly transferable digital money could perform intelligent functions far beyond anything money has been capable of before. For instance, with simple math programmed in, money could be made to calculate its own value, eliminating human speculation, manipulation, and error. Wouldn't that be something? In the meantime, efforts are already underway to reform the monetary system through legislation. Initiatives like the Monetary Reform Act and the American Monetary Institute's Monetary Act have already been written, prescribing in detail how to return the power to create money exclusively to government, and thus limit banks to lending existing money, just the way most people imagine it works now. While differing in detail, all such reform proposals in whatever country they originate always advance the same simple idea. The benefits of money creation belong to the public. At present, money is created not for the benefit of society, but for the profit of private banks. Banks like to create enormous amounts of money from our debt because the more we borrow into existence, the more interest the bank gets to collect, and the richer the bank becomes. In the process, the banks gain more control over everyone, individuals, industry, and government alike. Abundant money too often leads to speculative asset bubbles that make insiders rich. But, as we have witnessed, these bubbles inevitably burst under the unbearable weight of ever-increasing interest demands. The losers are many, including governments. Already burdened with huge debt and shrinking revenues, governments are forced to add trillions to that debt in order to rescue the banks that are the cause of the problem. Otherwise, we would have no money system. It's an absurd situation, and a tragic one, considering that government could instead create the money itself and spend it interest-free on infrastructure, education, or universal health care. And most of that debt-free money would enter the economy as wages, circulating through all levels of society for everyone's benefit. This kind of abundant money would fund a reinvigorated, productive economy in which the savings of the people could fund honest loans of real existing money. At its root, Money is a means by which we exchange real value. Without real value in the world, money is nothing. As we have seen, it's the real world that makes the loan, not the bank. We the people, in conjunction with the material blessings of the natural world, are the source of all real wealth. Therefore, money creation and its benefits belong to the public, not to private bankers. And what about interest? As we have seen, interest poses an arithmetic problem. And it's a problem that can only be solved in three ways. 1, defaults and foreclosures. 2, perpetual growth of the money supply. Or the preferable and only other solution, 100% recycling of interest as spending. But such full recycling could only be accomplished by nationalizing the banking industry in the public interest. For example, interest earnings from public service banking could be paid to all as a citizen's dividend. Or it could be used to fund government in place of taxes, as was done successfully in colonial Pennsylvania. And that's just one instance of a society that organized its monetary system differently. There have always been alternatives, and there are alternatives now. What the evolution of money really teaches us is that the real measure of money's value is, very simple, its usefulness as money. And there are several different ways to create useful money. For instance, money can simply be an individual's private promise to pay, a pledge of one's own product or service, as in such community currencies as the let system or time dollars. Thousands of these community currencies already exist in circles of trust where members can be counted on to honor the credit they issue for themselves. And such community currencies can be a lifesaver in the event of a catastrophic collapse of the conventional banking system. When money shortages or hyperinflation disrupt trade and bring economic standstill, a working community currency can sustain a local economy. Are such proposals radical? You bet. But there are unprecedented challenges before us. No longer can exponential growth allow us to sustain a monumental debt that must ever increase to prevent the house of cards collapse of the whole system. Increasing wealth disparity, crushing debt, failing banks, and social and environmental catastrophes are what we face unless we radically change course. We must transform our monetary system to one that can adapt to a future we can now clearly foresee. To begin, we must examine monetary system designs that can deal with widespread economic shrinkage without inducing mass foreclosures and bankruptcies. But what can you do right now? Well, right now there are people and organizations around the world that understand the problems and the injustice of today's monetary system, and you can join them in their effort to bring about the fundamental changes we need. It's time to talk to our friends. A financial crisis is the ultimate teachable moment. When bankrupt banks have to be bailed out by the governments the banks were formerly lending to, the contradictions, the fraud, and the fatal flaws of the current system are laid bare for all to see. But the solutions are there to see too if we look. We cannot afford business as usual. Making adjustments to the current system will not save us. The changes we need to make are radical and dedicated to the good of all, not the profit and control of a few. To make these changes, we must leave behind our outmoded assumptions and misplaced faith. We must face the challenge of a complete transformation. Reality calls. Life has always been a challenge. When one has a problem and wishes to solve it, first one must determine what is the root cause of the problem. Simple problems have simple solutions. Complex problems are, well, more complex. An obvious problem with our current financial system is that it rewards greed and corruption. Greed and corruption seem to be everywhere. But are greed and corruption the root causes of the problem, or are they the result of the way the system is built? Logically, one should first ask, are there built-in reasons why the system works the way it does? And if there are, can they be built out? Some say the basic reason the system is unstable and leads inevitably to corruption is the charging of interest. As explained earlier in this series, in our current bank credit as money system, the principal amount of a bank loan is simply created from the borrower's promise to pay back the principal plus interest in money. But the money to pay the interest is not created. The obvious but untrue conclusion is that it would therefore be mathematically impossible to pay off all debts. Many who call for money reform call for the abolition of interest as the solution to the problem. But is interest really the problem? Yes, there would be a serious mathematical shortage if all loans were concurrent and had to be paid back in one lump sum. That problem might apply to gangland loans and sometimes to farm loans, but that's not how the banking system works in general. Bank loans usually get paid back in a series of payments over a period of time, and for good reason. Money is both a stock, the amount in existence at any one time, and a flow, the transactions over time that the money is used for. Flow works like this. If I, the rich guy, lend you $1 and that was the only dollar in existence, the stock, could you pay me back $100? Well, if it had to be paid in one lump sum, no. That other $99, the interest on the loan, would be impossible to pay. It would be impossible to pay even in $2 payments, because there is only $1 in existence. But if I let you pay me the $100 in $1 payments, magic happens. In fact, in $1 payments, you could pay me back any amount of interest if you lived long enough. The only condition required to make full payment of a $100 debt with only $1 in existence is that I give you the opportunity to earn or otherwise get that dollar back each time you pay it to me. This is the flow, and by means of the flow, the same dollar can be paid any number of times and becomes effectively many dollars, all legitimately representing the work done to earn them. It is always the work, the real value, that pays the debt and gives the dollar its value, not the dollar itself. The relationship in our example is dreadfully unequal, because the man with the money has enslaved the man without it, just like the real world, some would say. But a simple loan at interest need not produce a shortage of money or cause unpayable debt if flow is 100%, as in our example. Flow is the real measure of economic activity. It's much more significant than the stock in a money system, as it multiplies the effective money in circulation. Given that today we use an exclusively debt money system, what is flowing in all these transactions is credit or promises to pay money. This credit is ultimately nothing more than the promises of borrowers to pay this credit back, usually according to a time schedule and usually with interest added. To pay this credit back, most of us will have to work and earn it by being productive. So, therefore, the real value of the money that flows in our economy today is created by our promises of future productive work. We take a loan in order to have something now rather than later. We agree to pay interest on into the future, thus reducing our future spending power, often by more than the amount of the original loan. However, with an understanding of flow, we see that there's no intractable arithmetic problem with the charging of interest. The problem is a social and systemic one. Lenders have neither obligation nor incentive to spend all their interest income so that the borrowers can earn it again and again. In fact, money lent once into existence is lent as existing money a second and a third time in expectation of more gain. The problem is basically one of incomplete recycling, where money needs to be spent, earned, and used to extinguish the debt that created it. It is instead lent or invested for gain. In other words, money that must be extinguished is, instead, expected to grow forever. Here's another simple example of a basic mechanism inherent to all lending. Let's say I lend you $100 and you spend it into circulation. It eventually ends up in the possession of someone who doesn't need to spend it and decides to lend it instead. Now once again, let's say this is the only $100 in existence, so you have to borrow it from the secondary lender in order to pay off your debt to me. But now you have to borrow it from me to pay the secondary lender. This twice-lent money has become a perpetually unpayable debt. This debt can never be extinguished, nor even reduced without a default. Notice that interest doesn't even enter into this equation. The problem of perpetual debt remains, interest or no. And even if the money itself is of intrinsic value, like gold or silver, or if it is issued by governments as cash, twice-lent money creates perpetual debt exactly the same way. When the same money is lent at interest, several times simultaneously, not only is the debt perpetual, society as a whole is paying moneylenders multiples of the interest rate for the use of the same money. There's an expectation that existing money should increase indefinitely by being lent at interest. But this requires us to mentally divorce the money from the debt from which it came. However, the reality is, every dollar created today has a scheduled appointment to be extinguished as a principal payment on the loan that created it. And that's why debt money can't be separated from the debt that created it. It's like a yo-yo spun out into circulation in the economy for a while and then pulled back in at the appointed time. In order for the yo-yo to be free to return, all of the debt money needed to extinguish the debt has to be available to be earned. The flow must be complete. Can't we just pay off these debts with other money? But what would other money be? Today, the amount of physical cash and coin in circulation is very small. Almost all money is bank credit, debt money. So if almost all money comes into existence the same way, then it's valid to picture each debt money dollar as having its own cycle from creation to destruction. So, the question, can we pay off debts with other money? No, there is no other money, as all of it is similarly committed to debt in one form or another. Therefore, the only way to ensure current payments can be made is to constantly increase the total amount of money in the system. But more money in a debt money system means more debt, so the debt hole in reality just deepens. Since debt is money in this system, it creates the fantasy of wealth for a while, but fantasies must come to an end. The day of reckoning can be pushed back, but only by passing the debt on to generations yet unborn, which is precisely what we are doing now. Government debt piles up endlessly. Corporate debt piles up. Consumer debt, too. As long as total debt keeps increasing, the system can stay ahead of the debt monster. But all of this debt is an absurd fantasy that our descendants will surely never repay. Nor would they be advised to, as repayment of debt would eliminate the money stock and plunge the world into a depression. Once real growth levels off due to the inherent limits of human productivity or the limited resources of a finite planet, this growth-dependent money system can only resolve its impossible arithmetic in a destruction of value. This can either happen through a deflationary spiral of credit defaults and falling prices, or by the devaluation of the money unit. Taken to extremes, either course of events will destroy an economy and even a civilization. The only other choice is debt forgiveness. In the ancient world, a regular debt jubilee, society-wide forgiveness of debts, was a common practice to deal with these unavoidable problems with lending. It was considered normal, even by the rich and powerful, that the general good of society took precedence over the rights of those rich enough to be lending money for profit. Some say that the money system's problems would be solved if we returned to using gold for money, or silver, or some other limited or hard commodity like oil or energy in general. They argue that this prevents money from being created in excess and backs it with real value. However, it also makes those who actually possess the selected physical substance the only ones with real money. Everyone else would only have a claim on real money. For instance, gold. How would we ever transition back to an honest gold economy with a natural distribution of gold among the population? That's long gone. And why would we want to do that? The gold-based money system is our past. It's how we got to where we are today. Gold is inconvenient. Even more so is a barrel of oil. Therefore, whether gold or oil or kumquats, trade will be carried out in promises. The real question is, if we are going to trade using promises of delivering something of real value, why gold? In fact, why any single commodity? At this time in our evolution, doesn't this very old idea of money merit serious re-examination? It can be argued that our current elastic debt money is backed by real value, every bit as meaningfully as gold. That's because money, most of which is created as mortgages, represents the value of the assets pledged as collateral. So is bank credit money actually a claim on the real estate pledged to create it? Not directly. Bank credit money can be a claim on anything. Now, anything includes the real estate pledged as collateral, so it can be a claim on the real estate that was pledged to create it. So how is a promise of real estate any less valid than a promise of gold? Both gold and real estate can change value relative to other commodities. Neither is a permanent standard. In fact, there can never be a permanent standard of value because value is always subjective and variable. So it would seem that the crucial difference between a claim on gold and bank credit is that bank credit is not a claim on any specific real thing, while the promise of gold is. The promise of gold has to be a promise of a specific amount of a specific real thing from a specific promiser. Isn't that the essential reason why many people would consider a promise of gold the better promise? But that is only true if the promise is reliable and what is delivered is really gold. with the discovery that some of the gold bullion sitting in central banks is actually relatively worthless tungsten plated in gold, the whole argument that gold is the most solid, reliable money is shown to be neither solid nor reliable. Precious metal is susceptible to counterfeiting, it's heavy, and it's vulnerable to theft. So to return to commerce via the physical exchange of precious metal coins would mean civilization had reverted to a pre-electronic level of technology. In the absence of such a collapse, the economy would still wind up running on promises just as it does now. So once again, money would only be as good as the promises made, and there would be no need of actual precious metal coins if all transactions were carried out with promises. The fundamental question is, what does the need for money to enable trade have to do with the amount of some shiny metal there is, or the amount of any single natural resource or commodity, or real estate for that matter? Where is there any meaningful relationship between the functional need for money and any of these things? To answer that question, let's go back in time and find out when money started and why it became what it is today. We know that Stone Age people had money. In the Stone Age, before writing was invented, money had to be a portable object of value, because that was the only technology available. That's why rare shells and stones, from which jewelry could be made, were ideal as money. A rough standard of value for these money objects developed over large areas, enabling extensive networks of indirect trading. This way, people could obtain specialty items not available in their own environment, and look good doing it. The popular concept of jewelry as a store of value has continued to this day. In later agricultural civilizations, cattle were often the standard value objects for large transactions, and salt for small ones. Salt was rare in those days and valuable. Roman soldiers were paid in salt, thus the term salary, meaning payment for services. With the invention of writing, trade in other commodities could be carried out using promises of cattle and salt. The cattle and salt weren't necessarily what was finally delivered. They were just commonly understood units of value in which the real trade goods could be conveniently priced. Written credits were expressed in these two common units, although they represented a variety of real goods and services. This form of money was ideal for local economies, where traders were known to each other and pledges could be collected upon. Agricultural surpluses allowed some people to leave the farming to others and specialize in particular crafts. This resulted in improved skills and better tools, and that led to further gains in productivity. This specialization of labor required increased trade, as more people opted to produce a single item of enhanced value. They would then need to trade their specialty for the broad spectrum of necessities that past generations had produced for themselves. But direct barter was inefficient. So more trade led to a greater need for money. Over many centuries, various forms of money were tried. Eventually, gold and silver coins proved to be the most useful money objects because they were conveniently portable and similarly valued across large areas of the civilized world. They were also easily standardized for weight and purity, and did not require enforcement of value by some authority, nor redemption in goods from someone far away. Thus, for very good reasons, gold and silver became the universally successful international currencies, accepted as final payment of debt almost everywhere. The problem with a system in which money is a standard commodity is that it is most efficient when only one standard commodity is used. But if you do that, it makes the value of money exclusively dependent on the quantity of that one commodity in relation to all other commodities. For example, the Spanish thought they would be fabulously wealthy with all the gold they stole from the Aztecs and the Incas, and then turned into money back home. But when the gold got back to Europe, sure, the amount of gold increased, but it didn't increase real productivity in proportion. Fertilizer would have been more useful for that. So because there was no big increase in real stuff to buy with it, the value of gold decreased, and the Spaniards discovered that gold had no absolute money value in itself, as many people had imagined it would. Its value was determined by its abundance relative to the value of real goods and services to be bought. Yet many continue to argue that the value of gold, a luxury item of no practical use to most people, should be the measure of value for all the real goods and services essential to our lives. While some campaign for a return to gold, others mistakenly believe that today's money still does represent gold held in a vault somewhere. That hasn't been true for decades. In our current money system, we use national fiat currencies and bank promises to pay in national currencies as the standard commodity instead of gold. National currencies used to be promises to pay in gold or silver, but way more promises were made than could be honored, so that system fell apart. Today, national currency is just legally enforced money, what they call fiat money. That is, it's money you have to accept because the government says so. To many, this government fiat money is just worthless paper. But is it really? We can pay our taxes with it, and governments, especially local ones, provide essential services paid for with those taxes, like roads, schools, hospitals, libraries, police, and military. So government fiat money isn't worthless at all. Now, it is true that consumers of government services have no individual free market choice as to what their tax money is spent on and what services they receive. In fact, many taxpayers may not want those services. So therefore, this money can rightly be accused of being monopolistic, coercive, and socialist. But government is coercive, monopolistic, and socialist by nature, isn't it? What else should it be? Government in a democracy or a republic is ideally a single authority, empowered by society to enforce laws agreed upon by society for its own collective benefit. In a free market economy, government must provide the level playing field of law within which the free market can function. And it also has to provide the referees to enforce the rules of the game. Those who are nostalgic for the freedom of the frontier should recall that the first thing early settlers usually did was elect a sheriff and build a jail and collect taxes to pay for both, for good reason. So government fiat money isn't inherently worthless by nature. Governments at all levels offer vital services in exchange for it. It only becomes worthless when government creates too much of it, which it often does, and for the worst reasons. While many reformers are fixated on the differences between gold and fiat currency, what's more important is the essential similarity. Being single, uniform commodities, gold, silver, national currencies, and bank credit all share the characteristic common to monies for millennia past. The more money there is, relative to the real things available to buy, the less the money unit is worth. Thus, the total quantity of money in circulation is extremely important to maintaining the general price levels. And today, this quantity is largely determined by the demand for new money to purchase real estate and speculative equities. This makes the supply of money for general trade particularly vulnerable to real estate and stock market bubbles. Perhaps the most significant problem with money as a single commodity is its tendency to concentrate wealth. Those who have no money must get it from those who have it to lend. Anyone with extra money can lend it at interest, and if, rather than spending all of the interest, they add any of it to their lending capital, they will accumulate even more money to lend. One reputable study counted all the ways we pay interest, directly on our own debt and indirectly in prices and taxes for corporate and government debt. This was compared to the interest we earn from all sources. This study found that only the richest 10% come out ahead. The next 10% do little better than break even, and the remaining 80% pay more than they receive, the poorest losing out the most. Now, in our current bank credit system, money is created as debt to banks. This debt is required to be repaid to the banks in money, either fiat cash or bank credit. Therefore, the ability of all borrowers to repay depends on the availability of fiat cash or bank credit. The supply of fiat cash is controlled by the nation's central bank, but fiat cash makes up only a very small proportion of money. Usually about 95% of all money is bank credit. And who controls the availability of bank credit? The banks? Well, on the one hand, what the banks can do is constrict the supply of credit any time they want to, with high interest rates or by just not granting loans. On the other hand, the banks can lower interest rates and encourage borrowing, but they can't expand the money supply unless borrowers are willing to borrow. If cautious and reliable borrowers are in short supply, banks must take bigger risks, as interest must be paid to depositors and banks cost money to run. The bank credit money supply is, as they say, highly elastic. And because it's based on the willingness of borrowers to borrow and the reliability of borrowers' credit, it is vulnerable to both rapid expansion and drastic shrinkage. Also, everyone is legally obliged to pay in money. Now, money in reality is just an accounting of debt, and accounting follows strict rules, so the whole situation is governed by inflexible numbers. That's why a sudden shrinkage in the money supply caused by some defaults has the inevitable follow-up effect of causing more and more defaults and even more shrinkage of the money supply. This self-reinforcing downward suction leads us into economic collapse and the economic and social absurdity of unemployed, dispossessed people camping outside their empty, vandalized homes. And what does the government do about it? It loads bankrupt taxpayers with astronomical fantasy debt that will never even be reduced, never mind paid off. All this is done to fill up the negative balance sheets of the banks with money the banks never had in the first place. And then they use it to pay themselves obscene bonuses. Life is good for those who know how to play the system. The bailout scam was the biggest daylight robbery in the history of the world. So far. All of these tendencies of the money as commodity system are features of the system itself. The greed and corruption comes in as those who understand the system profitably surf the inevitable waves of boom and bust. Those who understand the system know what's coming and even precipitate it when the time is ripe for them to take advantage of disastrous mass events for their personal and political gain. But it's the structure of the system itself which gives them the opportunity. And they have taken this opportunity over and over again since ancient times. People complain of the injustice, blame each other, blame the left or the right or whoever the scapegoat of choice is. But they never really catch on to the reasons this keeps happening. That's because most of us shy away from trying to understand the true nature of money and of freedom. The basis of freedom is essentially the freedom to exchange goods, services, ideas. If you create something in proven demand, you and only you should have the right and the freedom to create and spend the credit money needed by someone to buy it. Money as a portable uniform commodity was invented a very long time ago. It was the only choice using the technological means available at that time. But times have changed. So why is this outmoded technology still the prevailing concept we have for money? Could we go beyond money as we've known it? Could there be a new basis, a fresh concept, a design that could more effectively address the real purpose of money in the 21st century? Awareness of the need for real change in the money system is growing. But what direction to take? What exactly is the problem, and how can it be solved? The safest and only real choice, many people argue, is to return to gold, or a gold standard, because this worked for millennia in the past. But gold itself is impractical for transactions in the modern world. It was impractical centuries ago, which is why the promise to pay gold system developed. And so it is certain that, in practice, transactions would be conducted in promises to pay gold, not gold itself. Thus, the promises to pay gold money will only be as reliable as the promises. So in reality, it isn't the gold that makes the system work, it's the reliability of promises. Would they be reliable promises? Maybe. But what we would be using as money would be like the old goldsmith's promises, made in the knowledge that only rarely does anyone ever ask for real gold. This was the problem with the goldsmith situation. The real gold was seldom claimed, allowing fraudulent promises of gold to be made and used as money. Why would history not repeat itself if all the same elements remained in place? Another thing, what most people say they like about the gold system is that promise of gold money is a promise of a specific amount of real value. Now this is an odd idea, given that the vast majority of us have no use for gold, so how much real value can it have for us? Wouldn't a promise redeemable in food, clothing, or shelter be much more real? People also like the idea that gold is just gold, doesn't need a government to create it. However, it does need miners. In a gold money system, mining discoveries, jewelry making, industrial use, hoarding, and counterfeit bars of gold-plated tungsten would all influence the money stock. What on earth does any of that have to do with the need for money for trade? Lastly, gold as money is a single uniform commodity, manifesting all the inherent mathematical defects of lending demonstrated in part 1 of this movie. Being a coin with intrinsic value doesn't make any difference. A lot of gold and silver's appeal comes from a belief in an oversimplified version of history. People assume that coins were invented to standardize the inherent value of the metal they contain. This is true, but right from the beginning, some of the earliest coins were created based on a diametrically opposed idea. This was done because the rulers at that time foresaw the inevitable negative consequences of using limited supplies of precious metals as money. Therefore, they chose to avoid that route. Instead of precious metals, these rulers struck coins of iron or copper and defined their value by decree. What's more, these coins by decree were heated and dipped in vinegar, so the metal they contained would have no intrinsic value. These coins were in fact the original and true fiat money. They were merely tokens of value, money created by law and enforced by the ruler's authority. Pure fiat money is the other main idea favored by money reformers. They would restore fiat money to its true status as a national government monopoly on money creation. This current of money reform, in stark contrast to the gold advocates, insists that true money is fiat money by authority of the state. This money is to be simply spent into existence as a promise by the state to accept the same money back in payment of taxes. The taxes are compulsory, and the state also promises to enforce the acceptance of this money in court. These are very reliable promises and can result in very reliable money. if not abused. The problem these fiat money reformers have with the current system is that government has given away this power to private bankers and is now borrowing at interest money it could create itself with a few keystrokes, just like the banks do. This results in a massive unpayable national debt on which interest will forever be paid. This ever-growing national debt expands the money supply when new money is created by the central bank to buy more government debt. And the interest burden, passed on through taxes, adds to the cost of almost everything we buy, one way or another. In contrast to money being created as national debt, fiat money, simply spent into existence, would save the taxpayers immense sums of interest. It would free future generations from impossible debt, and it would forestall the tendency to inflation because the money supply would not grow forever with the national debt, as there would be no national debt. In the fiat money system, taking fiat money out of circulation by means of taxes preserves or restores the value of the remaining money in circulation. Not taxing it back sufficiently would devalue it. Understanding the proper use of government fiat money is a revelation. If you can charge prices or taxes for something in the future, you can issue that much new money now, because it is your valuable services to others and the reliability of your promises that create the real value of any money. The government can honor its promises to accept its money back in taxes, and it will make your debtors pay you in government fiat money if you take them to court. These are good reasons why government-issued money works now, and why it would work if governments just self-issued this credit instead of borrowing it from banks. But in this pure fiat money system, the money supply must still be determined by central authority. Therefore, the money supply is still limited, monopolistic, and managed from above. They have the power to create money, and you have to get the money from them. They also have the power to create way too much money and spend it on wars and other unproductive activities without the approval of those whose productivity gives that money its value. In the current system, these inflationary debts are now beyond absurd, threatening to crash the entire system and drag the whole world into chaos. To save themselves, governments are now laying impossible claims upon the productivity of generations yet unborn, a truly hopeless cause given the overall world situation. Witnessing government performance to date, many people believe that returning the full power to create money to corrupt, incompetent politicians would not only fail to solve our problems, it would be the height of insanity. It would really all depend on the quality of the people in government. Fiat money reformers believe there would have to be a substantial revolution in government to wrest this power back from the banks. Therefore, they believe it would be reasonable to expect that honest and competent people with a sincere concern for the public good would be in charge. But, good guys or bad, we would still be dependent on some distant someone else to maintain the value of our money. And they would have 1,000 pressures and temptations to enrich themselves by not doing so. And like gold as money, government fiat money is a single uniform commodity, manifesting all the inherent mathematical defects of lending at interest and twice lent money. Once the government creates the fiat money, and it goes into the banking system to be lent at interest, the problems created in the current system will continue as before. So, this pure fiat money idea might be very useful in rescuing governments from their own hopeless financial positions, and it is a limited example of the self-issued credit principle being advocated here. But pure fiat money would not address the root problems inherent in the math of lending, unless the principle were expanded beyond government. Advocates of pure fiat money like to claim it is money created by law, as if it were independent of economics. But if new fiat money were just spent into existence year after year without being removed from circulation as taxes, it would become worthless. What these fiat reformers tend to ignore when quoting history is that in ancient money created by law systems, the prices of critical commodities were also dictated by law. In fact, the value of money was defined by the ruler as so much of a certain commodity. Charge more or less for the designated commodities and it could be off with your head. Today, price controls like this could only be achieved in a self-isolated and totally bureaucratically controlled economy like Soviet communism. In a free market global economy, money created by law is bound by the same laws of supply and demand as any other single uniform commodity money. In other words, pure fiat money in a free market is an illusion. There's no such thing. In the third stream of money reform are the various types of so-called alternative currencies, all of them based on some concept of money being created as self-issued credit. Many examples of such systems exist today all over the world. Some are very successful business-to-business barter networks, in which businesses create product credit money to use among themselves, independent of banks and government, and usually interest-free. Such systems are tolerated, and in Switzerland the existence of the Weir system is generally credited with stabilizing the banking system by expanding when the conventional system contracts and vice versa. But in the past, when they became too successful, alternative currencies were usually suppressed by the banking system or even outlawed by government. So, active suppression is the most significant external problem. The most common inherent problems with these systems are their limited scope and acceptance, their operating costs, and the unreliability of member credit. What the conventional banking system provides, worldwide reach, affordability, credit checks, and debt enforcement, are the necessary services that are usually inadequate or prohibitively expensive in the alternative systems. Once the small group of idealistic and honest originators are joined by members exhibiting the full range of human behavior, alternative systems discover they must deal with cheaters. Some are deliberate cheaters, others just not too conscientious about their debts. And at the opposite end of the spectrum are the hyper-conscientious people who won't issue credit because they are afraid they won't be able to fulfill it. A self-issued credit system cannot work if the members are afraid of issuing credit. And that is why it makes far more sense that government and essential industries like farming, forestry, mining, manufacturing, and construction should be the main and widely accepted sources of self-issued credit, not vulnerable individuals trading haircuts for pottery. However, we are talking about creating a truly liberated system of exchange. Therefore, in this proposed new system, anyone would have the freedom to issue credit, because only voluntary acceptance would determine the circulation of it. The costs of accounting in self-issued credit systems could be overcome entirely by emerging technologies, allowing the creation of a digital coin. Digital coins could be passed from one owner to another, peer-to-peer, so that no bookkeeping and no third-party involvement, like banks or PayPal, is required. This leaves only the problem of achieving global spread. Thanks to technology again, this could now be achieved at little cost and at the same rate and with the same ease that the existing social networks like Facebook and Twitter have spread. So there is a positive answer to all the questions we have posed in this movie. And there is a solution that has the potential to unite the three seemingly conflicting schools of money reform into one cohesive movement for fundamental monetary change. Because, when examined closely, be it gold, tax receipts, or someone's goods and services, all three schools of money reform are really calling for the same thing. Money that is redeemable for something specific from someone specific. Once one comes to that realization, it becomes obvious that self-issued credit for the full range of goods and services in demand would necessarily include gold, silver, and government tax receipts, as these are also things in demand. We just need to look beyond obsolete beliefs to see the heart of the situation. The all-inclusive self-issued credit system, the basis for almost all so-called alternative currencies, could contain within it both the precious metal and the payable for tax models of money without any contradiction. Money has both religious and social histories that are fascinating and go well beyond just the need for trade. But for our practical purposes in this presentation, money is the invention that overcame the limitations of direct barter. Money is, therefore, a technology, a way to solve a problem. Most of us would agree that we have a problem with our money system. This is no surprise once we realize the current system was designed by bankers in their own interest, and governments wanting to pump out artificial money to wage war and pay for it with the hidden form of taxation called inflation. It was not a well-thought-out project of mathematicians and engineers seeking to create a money system for the general benefit of humankind. There are now many people, including mathematicians, engineers, and even cartoonists, trying to rethink money as the need to do so becomes obvious. In this presentation, we've proposed that we return as close to direct barter as we can, because doing so would anchor the money system directly to the real-world things we want to exchange. The destructive flights of fantasy money that have brought the current system to its breaking point would not be possible. Self-issued credit is not a new idea. It is, in fact, an idea as old as numbers and written record-keeping. That is very old. However, only with our new technologies can it finally achieve its full potential as an international medium of exchange. And this transformation is already underway. Extensive electronic barter networks, some with their own currencies, exist among businesses right now. These could grow into a new global money system. In Canada, Canadian Tire money has been a self-issued credit for goods currency for decades. This money is redeemable for merchandise at Canadian Tire stores only, but is widely exchanged as payment by third parties because almost everyone eventually buys something at Canadian Tire. Like air miles and other bonus point systems, it is only a customer reward program at present. But anything that can serve the purpose of money can be money. Private enterprise self-issued credit money already exists in several forms all over the world, and more private enterprises are going in this direction. Money becomes money by acceptance. So one could say the path to freedom lies before us if we can only accept new and broader ideas of what money is. Looked at logically, why wouldn't a legally binding contract for delivery of specific goods and services from a specific supplier be much more acceptable as a medium of trade than the much abused government bank monopoly money we are using now? And does it not seem natural and logical that the source of money should be the same as the source of real wealth, the productive members of society? And does it not seem natural and logical that the value of anyone's credit should be determined solely by their own proven success at living within their means, no one else's? And does it not seem natural and logical that the value of what we have earned with our work and productivity should not be susceptible to being destroyed or stolen by the gambling of some very greedy people? We hope that watching the Money is Debt series has given you insights into why our money system functions the way it does. We also hope that we've demonstrated how a return to gold or a switch to any single uniform commodity as money does not solve the fundamental problems with money. Manipulation of single commodity money has milked productive people of their life energies and prosperity for millennia. That this predatory wealth extraction system could soon take the form of a single global bank emerging as an unaccountable big brother world dictatorship should concern everyone. We hope you're encouraged to do your own thinking about money, a subject that has been ignored and misunderstood by the public for much too long, to our great disadvantage. And, not to criticize without offering an alternative, we have, in this final movie of the series, offered a comprehensive and detailed picture of how a radically new economic system might work if interest-bearing product vouchers were the medium of exchange, thus eliminating money as a commodity in itself. Instead, money would be a global measurement unit like minutes, meters, and tons. The existing physical situation on this planet is not sustainable, and the number one technical obstacle to doing anything serious about it is the current growth-addicted money system, which is itself unsustainable. The crisis is upon us. If you'd rather think about solutions than despair about the problems, think about taking back our money power with self-issued credit. Join with others who realize the need for radical change and spread this knowledge and understanding as fast and as far as you can. The masses of people must take upon themselves the responsibility to wake up, realize our power, and create something better.